Hello, my name is Elaine Harvey, and I am presenting on the Endangered Species Act of 1973. The Endangered Species Act is one of the few environmental laws passed in the 1970s. The policy was created to protect critically imperiled species from extinction, such as the bison and the whooping crane. The ESA was signed by President Richard Nixon on December 28, 1973, and it is administered by two federal agencies, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. Purpose of the Act. Congress found that many species of fish, wildlife, and plants in the United States have been rendered extinct as a consequence of economic growth and development of untempered by adequate concern and conservation. Policy was created to protect ecosystems endangered or threatened species depend on, and to provide a program to provide conservation for endangered or threatened species. All federal departments and agencies seek to conserve endangered and threatened species. Congress and federal agencies shall work with state and local agencies to resolve water resource issues in regards to conservation of endangered species. There is a long history of policy development that led to the establishment of the Endangered Species Act. The Lacey Act of the 1900s was the first federal law that regulated interstate transfer of wildlife. And then in 1929, there was the Migratory Bird Conservation Act. And then in 1940, to protect the bald eagles, there was the Bald Eagle Protection Act. And then in 1966, Public Law 89-669, the Endangered Species Preservation Act was established, which authorized a listing of 77 species, which were mostly invertebrates. The first endangered species list was issued under that act. It included 14 mammals, 36 birds, 6 reptiles and amphibians, and 22 fish. There is a longer history of the development of the Endangered Species Act. In 1969, there is Public Law 91-135, which is titled the Endangered Species Conservation Act of 1969, where it had an expanded list of species and invertebrates and required measures to enlist international agreements. And following this, there was the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. The CITES Agreement, which was amongst 80 nations to ensure that trade did not threaten species survival. Endangered Species Act initiation and process. The ESA was introduced by Harrison Arlington Williams Jr., a New Jersey senator, and he was a Democrat. Committee consideration was by the Senate Commerce Committee, and the act was passed by the Senate on July 24th, 1973, and it passed the House on September 18th, 1973. And it was reported by Joint Conference Committee on December 19th, 1973, with agreement by the Senate on the same day, and agreement by the House on December 20th, 1973. The act was signed into law by President Richard Nixon on December 28th, 1973. Major amendments to the Endangered Species Act. In 1978, under Public Law 95-632, a committee was created, identified as the Endangered Species Committee, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service were now required to designate critical habitat when new species were listed, and the U.S. Department of Ag were required to develop conservation plans for their land with listed species. In 1982, under Public Law 97.304, the amendment included prohibiting removal of endangered plants from federal lands and allowed incidental take permits for non-federal activities, and it also included the Section 10 consultation to the Endangered Species Act. Another major amendment to the Endangered Species Act included Public Law 100-478 in 1988. This amendment, Congress required U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to monitor all recovered species and candidate species. And also Congress required all federal agencies to notify the public of all federal recovery plans for each species. Endangered Species Act and private property. Approximately half of all listed endangered or threatened species have an estimated 80% of their habitat on private lands. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are required to designate land and habitat for a listed species and its conservation. The ESA prohibits anyone from taking listed species. To take a listed species means to harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, or collect illicit species. Private property can be regulated unless the landowner receives federal approval through a take permit. Individuals who knowingly take illicit species can be fined up to $25,000 per violation or instance, and individuals who knowingly take listed species can be fined $500 per each violation or instance. Private landowners can get a permit from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the NIMS to get an incidental take permit, which requires them to have a conservation plan. And the ESA allows taking of listed species if individuals are protecting themselves from bodily harm. There are special exemptions for private owners. on private lands where they can kill or harm a endangered species. And here are two examples. In North Carolina, their private landowners are allowed to kill or injure red wolves attacking their livestock. And also in Minnesota, federal officials are permitted to harm gray wolves attacking livestock or crops. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and here are a list of references.